Thanks to Asia Society. Thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. I've had the good fortune of speaking at the Asia Society Switzerland before, but online. So it's nice to be here finally back in person. What I thought I would do in about 20 minutes or so is talk a little bit about the changing norms around religion, citizenship, and belonging in India. Any of you who are familiar with the news know that this is quite the topic du jour right now. As Rebecca mentioned, that's 2 weeks ago now, India celebrated its 75th anniversary of independence. The Prime Minister emerged on the ramparts of the Red Fort, as he or she does every August 15th, to kind of give a State of the Nation address. And I would say that this year's anniversary had provoked two reactions. One was one that was quite celebratory. If you think back 7.5 decades ago, the number of naysayers, many of them were Indian, who did not believe that India would survive as a multi-ethnic, low-income democracy. India has proved all of the critics wrong. But I would say that the 75th anniversary also provoked a sense of disquiet, that India is perhaps moving away from some of its liberal, democratic, constitutional norms around secularism, equal protection under the law, equal citizenship, and so on and so forth. And, anyone who opens up the newspaper or a magazine like The Economist or the television will see headlines such as these about the rise of a new reinvigorated Hindu nationalism, a evolution of a far-right agenda, a slide towards liberalism. These are not merely anecdotes that we read in the news media. There is more systematic evidence collected by various research organizations suggesting that we are seeing some kind of democratic backsliding or regression in India. This is data from the Varieties of Democracy Institute based in Sweden, which produces the kind of annual league tables where they measure democracy around the world. And you can see in their 2021 report, India found mention in their top 10 autocratizing countries. And you can see here that the slide was significant enough to provoke a change in how India is classified from being an electoral democracy to being an electoral autocracy. And what that means is that the norms and rules and traditions of elections are still quite robust, but it's really this democratic space between elections that seems to be wanting. Freedom House, which is another major producer of such tables, also downgraded India from being free to partly free, right? So being more in this kind of hybrid zone. So what I thought I would do in the next 15 minutes or so is really talk about four things. One is some of the master narratives that have animated kind of ideological conflict over the past 7.5 decades around the idea of India, and what India is and who India belongs to. Then talk a little bit about the more recent rise of the BJP and the ushering in of what I and others have called the quote unquote ethnic state and what some of those attributes are. And then I'll end with implications, and I'm sure we'll have much more to discuss in the Q&A with all of you and the conversation with Rebecca. So let me just start with master narratives. I think if you think about the traditional ideas of India, there have been sort of three competing themes for how one defines this unit, right? The first is a sort of idea or nationalism based on territory, right? This notion that there is a sacred geography that is uniquely Indian, right? That is bounded by the Himalayas, by the Indus River, by the Arabian Sea, by the Bay of Bengal, that even prior to the invention of the modern nation state of India, there was this attachment to a place called India, even though it's referred to by many different names, right? So this is a notion of this kind of sacred territory defining what India is. There was a second competing theme, and it's a theme that we commonly associate with individuals and leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, which was really based around a kind of cultural nationalism, right? Gandhi's philosophy was that India could only exist, at least in any semblance of a democratic framework, if it found unity by leaning into its incredible diversity, right? That a successful India could not be monolithic. It would have to be a mosaic of different religions, of different languages, of different beliefs, of different customs, of different cuisines, and so on and so forth. And so you could be a Hindi speaker living in Tamil Nadu who's a Christian. You could be a Muslim Urdu speaker living in Maharashtra. You could be a Sikh farmer living in Punjab, speaking only Punjabi, and still somehow have some common association or belief in Indianness, right? You could have these multiple complementary, sometimes conflicting, overlapping identities, but ultimately there was a kind of meta-Indian identity that everyone could sort of embrace. The third competing theme is one that really is much more narrowly pitched around the idea that there should be an alignment between the definition of the nation and a common religious unity, right? This is the kind of nationalism that we associate with the ruling BJP, and I'll say more about that. But the idea is very simple, that in a country where you have such a dominant majority, 80% of the population are Hindu, that Indian culture should be synonymous, should be coterminous with Hindu culture, right? Which does not mean that people of different backgrounds cannot live in India, but they should live in India, assuming they subscribe to or live up to a certain set of social norms, precepts that are dictated by Hindu spirituality and Hindu culture. Now, if you take these three competing themes, they sort of turned into two different political formulas, okay? So for the Congress Party, right, which was the sort of the vanguard of the nationalist movement, they embraced this idea of a sacred geography and married it with this Gandhian notion of cultural nationalism, right? This kind of very syncretic sort of view. The BJP and its predecessor, the Jan Sangh, had a slightly different combination where they too embraced this idea of a territorial nationalism, but they married it instead with a sort of religious nationalism. And there was a conflict. We should not forget, at the time of independence, at the time of the constitution-making process, about which of these two visions would triumph. Now, we know how that story ended. The Congress vision is the one that triumphed, represented in large part by Gandhi, Patel, people like India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. And their decision was to embark on an ambitious project of nation building by refusing to give pride of place to any one particular religion or community, right? Because they feared that by doing so, you would upset this nascent social compact that had formed in India. And they had a big warning sign in the manifestation of Pakistan, which decided to create a homeland for the subcontinent's Muslims and be an Islamic republic, right? India's post-colonial leadership said, we don't want to create a Hindu mirror image of that because we don't believe that is the path to peace and prosperity and stability. Instead, we want to be much more inclusive. Now, there was, of course, as I just mentioned, an alternative vision. And it's important to note that this vision was defeated, but it didn't disappear. It was very much there, and in fact has a very long lineage going back to the 19th century. This is a picture of Veer Savarkar, who is perhaps the foremost ideologue of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, who ironically derived a lot of inspiration from the kind of 19th century style European nationalism, right? Which was premised on trying to build a common kind of religious identity, a common language, a racial unity. You know, they looked at the experience of countries like France, which took peasants and turned them into Frenchmen and French women, who all had a kind of common belief system, they thought. And they wanted to replicate such an attempt in India. So in this conception of the nation, loyalty to sort of, Hinduness was paramount. Now, we don't have the time to go through what happened in the intervening 7.5 decades, but I just want to make a couple of quick points. Number one is that India adopted a very unique style of secularism, and it's very different from the kind of secular practice that we commonly see in the West, right? So in the United States, where I'm from, we think of secularism as the hard separation between church and state, right? The church and state should have nothing to do with one another. They operate in separate, independent spheres. That was not the model that India pursued. India's model was to say government will maintain an equal distance from and an equal embrace of all religious traditions, okay? What does that mean? In practice, it means the government can subsidize religious pilgrimages, but if it does so for Sikhs, it must do so for Muslims. The government can allocate resources to educational institutions which are founded by religious orders, but if it does so for Christians, it should do so for others, right? This is a very difficult equilibrium to maintain in practice. I think all of you can see how politicians might, opportunistically or cynically for political motives, decide to pander to certain communities at the time of elections, right? It could be Hindus, it could be Sikhs, it could be Muslims, and that is precisely what took place by many of the so-called secular parties, not least the Congress Party. This is a picture of former Congress Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who many of his actions, I think, would fall into this category. And so over time, this idea of secularism became very hollowed out. And I think for many Hindus and many people in India, secularism became a byword for minority appeasement, as opposed to something that was truly taking a principled distance from all religions. So secularism basically endured several important stumbling blocks. At the same time, you started to see the Savarkar kind of ideology represented by the BJP get more traction. Obviously, these two things are related to one another, saying, we are being made, we the Hindu population, being made to feel like minorities in our own country. And so it's sort of time to take our country back, right? I mean, this is not unlike what you might hear in many big countries, including the United States, right? We all remember Make America Great Again, right? It taps into many of these same sentiments. The big inflection point represented by the picture on your right was the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992. This is a 15th century Islamic mosque, which many Hindus believe was once stood a temple that marked the birthplace of the Hindu king Ram. Many workers associated or affiliated with the BJP and its networks razed this structure to the ground in 1992, and that became a big rallying point, a focal point for the kind of Hindu nationalist agenda. Now, this is a bit of a complicated chart, so let me just walk you through it. This is national election data from 1984 to the present. The dark blue bars are the number of seats that the BJP contested in national elections. The teal color are the number of seats that the BJP actually won. And the red line is their vote share, right? India has a first past the post electoral system with multiple parties. So the number of seats you win and the number of votes you get don't have any one-to-one correspondence. You can see they're kind of roughly moved together. You can see the BJP in 1984 contested in fewer than half of all political constituencies. There are 543 constituencies in parliament and won 2 seats in 1984. On the back of the mobilization of Babri Masjid, secularism stumbles, and other things, you can see that over the years it became more ambitious. The number of seats it contested, the number of seats it won, and the number of votes it gathered exponentially increased, and then sort of plateaued. You had the first BJP government under Prime Minister Vajpayee have almost a full term in office between 1999 and 2004. And then many people felt, well, okay, there is some popular appeal behind the BJP, but it really has this threshold of about 25% of the population. Now, what changed? This changed. The introduction of Narendra Modi. who can only be described as a sort of once in a generation political animal, who I like to say, to borrow an analogy from the United States, has the retail political instincts of a Bill Clinton, but the ability to deliver the sort of soaring oratory that Barack Obama had, right? It's very rare that you see both of these characteristics in one politician. Modi has that. His claim to fame had been as chief minister of the western state of Gujarat. And two things were notable about his dozen years in office. One is that he presided over the fastest GDP growth rates of any state in India during his terms in office. And number two, he was known as the sort of Hindu strongman. Many of you will be familiar with the 2002 riots, which broke out in Gujarat under his watch, in which more than 1,000 people were killed, a large majority of whom were from the Muslim community. These were sort of the two big facts that people knew about Modi. And he was able to weave a very compelling narrative about why essentially his record in Gujarat was an attractive model for what should happen to India as a whole. He won the first single party majority in parliament in 30 years in 2014, something that hadn't happened since Indira Gandhi. And I should mention one of the highest voter turnouts ever, right? This was quite a popular wave for Modi. 5 years later, in 2019, against all the odds, not only did he win election again in an outright majority, he did so with an even bigger mandate and even bigger voter turnout, right? So this is quite a historic accomplishment. Just one last word about the rise of the BJP. The BJP is a very unusual political party, and most of us in the West do not have the vocabulary to properly describe it. It is the political wing of a broader constellation of social organizations, civil society organizations that espouse or adhere to a common belief in Hindu nationalism. Okay, so you have what's here at the bottom known as the mothership, the RSS, which is the sort of National Volunteer Corps, the biggest NGO in India, which is the ideological wellspring that essentially sets out the standards, priorities, and policies of this larger movement. And the BJP is one entity within this larger family, right? Where you have more than 36 organizations which exist. The BJP is the political wing, the VHP is the kind of ecclesiastical wing, you have the ABVP, which is the student wing, you have a farmers union, you have a labor union, you have a women's union. And what's interesting or important to note is what this means is when the BJP is in power, they can do two things simultaneously. They can wield official governmental power, power of the state, but they also are able to control an unprecedented amount of civil society, raw street power through these organizations, right? So in terms of pushing policies, in terms of pushing legislation, in terms of winning elections and going door to door, no other political party can rely on a multi-million person army, right? Not a real army, but a metaphorical army of people who can campaign on their behalf, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. The rise of the ethnic state, what does that mean in practice? What does Hindu nationalism in power look like? I think we got the best glimpse of this starting in the summer and fall of 2019. Shortly after winning a second mandate, the central government unilaterally nullified a provision of the Constitution known as Article 370. Article 370 is a part of the Constitution which specifies the very unique relationship that the state of Jammu and Kashmir has with the Union. If you remember back to the independence moment, India was comprised of more than 500 individual principalities, right? There was the part of India that was governed by British India, and then there were 500 plus, we don't even actually know the exact number of princely states. Jammu and Kashmir was one of those, and India had to sign individual treaties or accession agreements with all of them. In Jammu and Kashmir's case, owing to a lot of historical factors and its status as a border state, its status as a state claimed by both India and Pakistan, a status as India's only Muslim majority state, what would come to be, Article 370 gave the state a semblance of constitutional semi-autonomy. Any legislation passed in Delhi had to be approved by the state assembly in Kashmir. Citizens from other states could not legally purchase land or property in the state. There were a separate set of state laws that the state assembly could enact that would only govern the state's residents, right? And this had been a sort of bugbear for a long time for the BJP, which did not like this sort of asymmetric federalism, where certain states got special privileges that other states did not enjoy. And the fact that this was India's only Muslim majority state, I think, rankled quite a lot of people. And so this is something that the government undid in 2019. At the same time it undid its status, it changed Jammu and Kashmir from being a state to being a union territory, which means it is now largely run and administered by the central government. No state in India has ever been demoted from being a state to being a non-state. In addition to doing that, they bifurcated it into two pieces. So you now have the union territory of Jammu and Kashmir and the union territory of Ladakh. A few months later, the parliament passed something known as the Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA. And what this bill says is that if you belong to the Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jain, Parsi, or Sikh community, and you originate from one of India's immediate neighbors, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, and you arrive before a certain date, you will be eligible for an expedited pathway to Indian citizenship. And the residency requirement that you must pass is cut in half for you. Now, if you look at this list, you'll notice that there's really only one group that is missing, right? Which is the Muslim community, right? So many people viewed this as a direct assault on the idea of secularism and equal protection. The defense of the government was saying, well, all of these countries, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, are Islamic homelands. So if there is somebody here who belongs to the Muslim community from one of these countries, well, they can go back to one of those countries. They don't have to be in India. Now, this on its own, I don't think would have provoked the kind of outrage and protest we saw on the street. The reason that this really created quite a groundswell is because of a parallel policy proposal that is still not been implemented or legislated nationwide, something known as the NRC, or the National Registry of Citizens. What is the NRC? The NRC is a nationwide enumeration of all people living in India with the explicit objective of determining who is actually a legal resident and who is a citizen and who is not. The idea being that if you uncover evidence that somebody doesn't have the proper documentation or isn't rightfully there, they should be stripped of citizenship and any other legal privileges and possibly deported. Now, think about how these two policy proposals act together. You have an NRC process. You are found to be lacking sufficient evidence of your Indian citizenship. If you're a Muslim, you have no safety valve because the Citizenship Amendment Act, which puts you on this expedited pathway, doesn't apply to you. But if you belong to one of these other communities, you're sort of thrown a lifeline, right? So this is why I think this quote is important, where the president of the BJP, Amit Shah, on the 2019 campaign said exactly this. He said, we will ensure the implementation of the NRC in the entire country to remove every single infiltrator from the country except people who come from all of these communities, right? Because these two things are sort of conjoined in some way. Now, like I mentioned, this has provoked quite a significant conversation in India today about who belongs, right? But I think there are two types of citizenship discussions or conversations that are worth having, right? The first is about the legal, technical, who is a citizen according to the Citizenship Act of 1955 as amended, right? That's the sort of legal form of citizenship I've been talking about. But then there's also sort of the social citizenship, right? Who feels like they're included? Who feels like the government speaks for them? Who feels like they have equal opportunity to enjoy sort of upward mobility and the rights and privileges that citizens enjoy. And I think this is where there is quite a lot of disquiet about the state of minorities in India today, specifically the Muslim population, because they are the single largest minority. But potentially, some people say the single largest minority community in the world, right? If you think about 14% of 1.3 billion people, it's a very big number. So what are some manifestations of that? Well, number one, you see that relative to their population share, Muslim representation in parliament, same in state assemblies, has stagnated. This has always been true, by the way, that there's been a discrepancy between the number of Muslims in the population and the number of Muslims in parliament, but you can see in recent years that gap has widened, where 15% of roughly 14 to 15 are in the population, and just about 5% in parliament. But you could look at a whole range of other socioeconomic indicators, right? Whether it's health, whether it's literacy, whether it's educational attainment, and find that Muslims are lagging behind. So this is a chart based on data on a multidimensional poverty, right? And what you can see here is in the gray bar, the incidence of poverty is the highest in the Muslim community, but they also enjoy the highest intensity of poverty, right? Meaning not just poverty of income, but poverty in terms of health, education, and other things, right? So this is quite worrisome. And there's been more recent data to suggest that the intergenerational mobility, so the ability of sons and daughters to fare better than their parents have, is not just stagnating, but declining. So what this chart shows here shows you the average educational attainment for children relative to their parents, right? And you can see that for forward castes and others, it's basically they've kept their kind of more elite status. It hasn't necessarily gone up or gone down. It's basically been the same. Dalit scheduled castes have actually done quite well, right? So Dalit children are doing much better today in terms of their educational outcomes in society than they were, people born in the 1960s and 70s. Same with Adivasis and scheduled tribes. Muslims are the real outlier here, right? You can see where in many cases, people who were born in the 1980s, for instance, are experiencing poorer outcomes than their ancestors had in previous generations. Last but not least, we have seen since 2014 a clear uptick in anti-Muslim violence. This is data which is not collected by the state. It has to be collected by civil society organizations. But what you can see here is that the number of incidents has gone up, the number of victims has increased, the number of perpetrators has gone up, and that there's a clear discrepancy, right, where you see Muslims have been the biggest victims of religious violence, but not necessarily the biggest perpetrators. Obviously, there's a mix of shades in both, right? But the trend is fairly clear. So let me just end here before we get into the conversation, just with some implications. So, I think many political scientists and observers worry that if India continues on its present path, it risks fulfilling the two-nation prophecy, right? And that was going back to the discussion earlier, that there needs to be separate homelands for Muslims and Hindus. One can be India, the other can be Pakistan. And again, India explicitly rejected that notion. But de facto, could that be where India ends up, right? I think that's a grave concern for many people. But the second is that deepening majoritarianism, regardless of whether you're ultimately optimistic or pessimistic about the very long run, could have very real short-term impacts in terms of inequality, in terms of development, in terms of social cohesion, frankly, just in terms of government functioning, right? If you look back to 2019 and the multiple major changes that took place with Kashmir Citizenship Amendment Act, a lot of governmental time, a lot of diplomatic time was spent not trying to pursue the furtherance of India's interests abroad. It was trying to defend India and governmental decisions in the wake of quite a lot of widespread concern, right? And so, one potential end game that, again, I think worries me is that you could end up with the development and emergence of a two-tier form of citizenship in which you essentially have a permanent underclass, right? I don't think that many people look at the situation and say, okay, 240 million Muslims are going to be deported, right? I mean, I don't think that in any world that's a possibility. But could you imagine a world in which a large section of them still reside in India, but enjoy a kind of lesser form of legal and or social citizenship that others enjoy? So I did not leave this on a very happy ending, but perhaps in the conversation we can get there somehow.
I'll try to.
So thank you very much.
Just before we start the conversation, quick reminder that people joining online can submit questions via the Q&A function. So if you have any questions, just type them in. So you did talk a lot, or you showed us especially also numbers of that show that especially Muslims do face inequality in India. Can you talk a little bit more about what actual structural discrimination there is? Like, talk about some examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been a variety of studies now which have uncovered evidence of this, right? So, for instance, there's been a very clever study done by, a number of studies actually done by economists looking at the labor market, where they essentially create identical CVs of people with the same educational professional qualifications, except names are changed, one being a clear Hindu name, one being a Muslim name, sending them out electronically to prospective employers and seeing the differential response rates. And not surprisingly, you see that Muslims are just less likely to be interviewed for an opening, despite the fact of virtually having identical credentials. And this was done experimentally, where you can actually, create sort of, identical conditions, right, except for the name change. So that's an example. We see it a lot in terms of housing, right? So there are many parts of the country, many cities where in many sections of the city, it is hard, if not impossible, for Muslims to, say, rent or take ownership of a flat. I have a personal friend who was living in Gujarat and had to get, the only way in which she was able to get a flat in Ahmedabad was under an assumed name, right? And so, that's anecdotal, but if one looks at more systematic data of segregation, now, you can't prove that all segregation is discrimination, right? Because there could be just actual sorting that takes place where different communities decide on their own to live apart. But I think it's suggestive that you certainly see a lot less intermixing. And so therefore a lot more ghettoization, right? And ghettoization in this is very different from the development of slums, right? Because ghettos are represented by people all up and down the class hierarchy, right? So you get bureaucrats who are Muslims with teachers, with manual workers, all living together because of this that takes place. So it's not just people at the lower end of the socioeconomic sort of spectrum, right? I think you see this a lot, frankly, in politics, right? I think, one of the big puzzles is, okay, well, if Muslims are 15% of the population, why wouldn't parties want to cater to them more? Because that's a section of the vote that you're missing out, right? But I think within political parties, there is a belief that if you picked Muslims in places that don't necessarily have a large Muslim population, you would not be able to sufficiently win over the votes of enough people to win that election, right? So I think you see this in a variety of domains.
Do you feel that the BJP is going further into the direction of a Hindu nation where policy and economy is actually based on religion? I think,
if we're being honest, there are multiple gradations of Hindu nationalism, okay? It in and of itself is not a monolithic enterprise, right? So I think there are moderates and there are extremes, right? So on the most moderate section, and they're represented in the BJP, there are people in the party and parliament who talk this way, believe this, that saying, look, we realize that pursuing a really stringent, vociferous majoritarianism is a recipe for disaster. So what we'd like to have instead is to have something, and it's very interesting. They invoke countries in Europe, they invoke the United States, saying, the United States is a country that is sort of founded on a set of Judeo-Christian beliefs. You see the Bible being used in a lot of popular symbology. That's what we want, right? We're not trying to erase the rights of any minority groups, right? Then you go to the opposite extreme, where people who would like to see something closer to a theological state. Now, that's a very small minority of people who prefer that. I think the median BJP politician or legislator is in between those two extremes. Now, what we don't know is where the politics eventually ends up, right? And I think, again, this is why the BJP is very complicated, because Mr. Modi as prime minister has to worry about two things. He has to worry about his party, but he also has to worry about the Sangh Parivar, this broader constellation of Hindu nationalist organizations, right? Because when you want to win elections, you need that sheer street civil society power in order to do so, right? And so sometimes when you see the government's actions, it can look a little bit like cognitive dissonance, right? They're going from this direction, going this direction. And I think part of that is because you're trying to triangulate these disparate interests, right?
How much is this also, India is huge. How much is this regional? Because the BJP, they're the first party that actually was able to do a Hindu mobilization. I think before, religion wasn't that much of a factor for voting, but they somehow managed to mobilize Hindus as a religious group. Is this something happening all over India, or are there differences?
Yeah, I think, what has prevented Hindu mobilization writ large in India has been caste in part, right? And that we talk about Hindus as 80% of the population as if they're one big block, but they're not. And I think one of the successful strategies the BJP has managed to employ is finding ways to transcend those caste boundaries. Now, part of that has been by appealing to religion, by saying, at the end of the day, we're all Hindus. And part of that, frankly, has been, Narendra Modi's own personal story as somebody who is a backward caste politician, right? And somebody who didn't come from elite society, saying, this is what the BJP wants to represent, is not just the kind of rule of a very elite, thin upper crust, but actually something that represents a much broader kind of rainbow coalition of Hindus, right? So I think one has to also give credit to what they've managed to do politically. That is it can't just be restricted to kind of appeals to kind of Hindu supremacy alone, right? It is not uniform across the country. What Modi was able to do when I showed you the evolution of the BJP vote share was to take the historic catchment area, which was kind of north, central, and parts of Western India, and expand the map, right? So the BJP is now a player in places like Jammu and Kashmir, where it never had any reach. It is now a player in northeastern India, which, by the way, is predominantly not Hindu, right? It has become a player only in some parts of the South. If you were to look at a map today, you will notice that the entire kind of eastern seaboard of the country, which means going from Bengal down to Orissa, going down to Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and Tamil Nadu, the BJP is a bit player in many of those states, right? It has not succeeded in winning power. They've improved. And so there is a lot of regional heterogeneity. And I think that one of the things that I think gives hope to the political opposition is federalism, right? And that there are still many states in which this contestation is playing out, and there are alternative visions being put forward.
Okay, so as we are running out of time already, one very short last question. For what democracy do you fear more? The US, where you are from, or India?
Which democracy, the fate of democracy do I fear most? I go back and forth. No, I will put my cards on the table. I mean, I'm deeply worried about the United States. I don't think in most parts of the world it's sufficiently recognized how close we came to a constitutional crisis and just unthinkable sort of reckoning just a few years ago. And, as we are litigating now, I think importantly and rightly litigating what took place on January 6th, what ways in which elections may have been undermined, the counting may have been undermined, and so on and so forth. We are simultaneously in need of looking backward and looking forward at what the challenges are coming in 2024, both in terms of the way in which voters are being disenfranchised, the way in which politicians are taking over election control from independent bodies and bureaucrats, and in the way in which anti-state violence is on the rise. And so I think you have to have a proper reckoning of what happened in the past, but not at the expense of thinking about what's coming in the future. And so, the kinds of conversations that I have now with friends and officials in the United States about the state of democracy are things that I scarcely could have ever sort of imagined. So in that sense, I think the existential nature of the crisis or the challenge or the threat seems hugely shocking, right? I mean, I think you look at these risk reports that political risk firms put out or banks sometimes put out, right? And I think there's a reason why in every single one of these, in the top 5, you will find that the United States domestic politics is a top 5 geopolitical risk for the world. And that says all you need to know.
Thank you so much for the conversation, Milan. Maybe a round of applause.